Chapter 3. The walls of Uruk were almost impossible not to gape at. Ammon had seen them several times during his trips to Akkad with his father, yet even so, he stood and gawped every bit as much as Balashi, who himself looked like a fish gasping for breath. Ammon actually felt relatively good, as he and Balashi had eaten and slept well on their way to Uruk. They had wandered through the countryside rather than following the road, lest Lipetenki's men overtake them, and the well-watered country around Eridu still bore the fruits, seeds, and animals in abundance that the gods had created when they made Eridu a garden and placed the first man in it. Ammon was still basking in the warm glow of a full stomach and the slight bit of pride he had earned at having outdone Balashi. He pretended to lick a bit of grease off his finger as he watched his bodyguard out of the corner of his eye. Balashi still wore the sour expression he had put on at breakfast, when Ammon had killed the lizard 5 times as fat and 3 times as long as the pathetic little skeleton lizard Balashi had found. In fact, with the exception of the sunburnt and peeling skin he had gotten from wandering outside without a hat for the past few days, Ammon could almost call himself content. Balashi, in contrast, was growing more and more discontented by the moment as they drew near to the city. "They'll never let us in. They'll kill us at the gates," Balashi muttered pessimistically as they drew near. "Thousands of people go in and out of the gates every day," Ammon replied. "The guards will probably not even give us a second glance." "You don't look like a peasant," Balashi told him. "Nobody could take you for anything but a half-boiled princeling." "So what does that make you?" Ammon retorted. "If I'm half-boiled, then you are well done." Indeed, for all of the great fuss Balashi made over Ammon's pallor, his bodyguard was as red and sweating as a spit of venison. That had been exactly the wrong thing to say. If Lipetenki has any sense at all, then he'll have warned his allies in Uruk to be on the watch for people who look out of place. They'll see that you and I haven't spent much time in the sun, then they'll take us at the gate and slit our throats. "That's ridiculous," Ammon replied. "He'll be too busy doing what he can to secure his throne to worry about us. 2 men dressed in wool going through the gates of the city with the rest of the farmers won't excite any commentary at all." "A man and a boy," Balashi corrected. "And maybe you're right, but don't do anything to attract attention. Hang your head, look at the ground, and avoid eye contact." "I had been planning on demanding that the guards fall to their knees and pay me the proper respect as the Prince of Eridu," Ammon replied derisively, adding a well-practiced eye roll for good measure. Balashi snorted. "Just see to it that you don't mention that name when we come within earshot of any of these people," he said seriously. The people he referred to were farmers, merchants, basket makers, and others who were streaming down the road toward the gates of Uruk, less than half a league away. From the look of it, they had lucked out and would be arriving on a market day. As they drew closer to the city, no one gave them a second glance. They flowed into the river of humanity, rushing toward the gates of the city. While all those around them seemed completely indifferent, Ammon couldn't help but stare in interest at all of the various types of people. For the most part, they were peasants and small folk, such as potters and masons, but there were a fair number of stranger-looking people as well. Over there was a group of fierce mercenaries with long, drooping moustaches wearing animal skins. Ammon supposed that they must have come from the far north, well beyond the Zagros Mountains. And back there was a patrol of Akkadians in their bronze-studded armor, arrayed around a palanquin carried by a half-dozen sweating slaves. As they passed the road which ran to the docks on the great river, they saw sea-going people with hard-lined faces and rolling gaits as they walked alongside their cartloads of wares. There was a strong scent of salt that came from the burlap-wrapped parcels, and Ammon found himself imagining what types of strange and exotic treasures they must have brought with them from far down the coast. There were also a large number of poorly dressed fisher-folk carrying woven reed baskets, with fish of every size and description. Eels ranging from fingerlings to great spiny things thicker around than Balashi's forearm, hundreds of tiny silver and black fish Ammon could not recall ever having eaten before, and hawking shaboot nearly as long as a man. The great shaboot were carried 3 or 4 at a time in woven slings hanging from poles carried across the shoulders of 2 men. Balashi seemed especially interested in a wagon loaded with turtles, many of them still alive. "They make great soup," Balashi said when he noticed Ammon watching him. "Lots of butter, garlic and onions." Suddenly, the lizard they had eaten for breakfast this morning didn't seem all that great compared to the amazing banquet flowing into Uruk. Ammon found himself thinking of all the different delicacies that had been available to him in the palace. He remembered the thick, crusty brown loaves of bread with creamy yellow butter and a piece of honeycomb on one side. As he let his mind linger over these memories, he found himself thinking of Father. On the mornings when Father wasn't too busy, he would invite Ammon to come break his fast in his rooms. Father had a notorious love of sweets, and they frequently breakfasted on pomegranates or apples drizzled with honey. They would lean back on the soft linen cushions, and Father would tell him stories of the gods, or of his ancestors, of the great heroes of the past who had personally spoken with Enki, or had been granted favors by him. One of Father's favorite stories to recount had been about how Inanna tried to get the sacred May from Enki by getting him drunk, and how he sent her off with gifts of wines and grains, animals and sacred laws. But while Inanna thought she had tricked Enki, he had held back from her his greatest treasures, the sacred relics which were hidden deep in the earth at the cave of the sacred waters. Ammon had always laughed at the way Father had mocked Inanna with a high falsetto voice and an unshakable surety in her own cleverness. As the walls of Uruk loomed high before them, Ammon found himself with a pain in his chest, as if a great hand had seized his heart and was squeezing it mercilessly. He found that the strange people in sight had lost all of their charm, and the day felt grey and heavy, as if all of the colour and vibrancy had drained out of everything, and what he wanted with all of his heart was to go home. He wanted to lie down in his rooms among his things. He most especially wanted to see Father again, to tell him of the horrible dream he had about the treachery of the high priest of Enki. Father would laugh in that way that he had, and his dark brown eyes would sparkle, and he would tell Ammon that everything was fine, and that everything would be fine forever. Father would remind him that they were protected by Enki, and no foolish priest, nor any other force in the world, could bring them harm. Balashi must have noticed that something was wrong, for he was there at Ammon's side, his big hand resting on Ammon's shoulder. "Steady, lad," he said. "Everything will turn out all right. First thing when we get inside the city, we'll find some place for a decent meal and some rest." Balashi's mention of a place to eat and rest was worse than if he had said nothing at all. It made Ammon recognize the gaping hole that had been torn in his life, a hole so large that just getting a decent meal was a luxury, and having a roof over his head was not something he could count on. But he didn't want Balashi to think him a weakling, so he squared his jaw and tried to find a safe thought to rest his mind on. "Look at the sharks," he said shakily. Balashi looked where he was pointing, and, sure enough, a fisherman had a basket full of sharp-toothed fish, each about the size of a cat. He frowned. "It doesn't seem like they'd be too tasty," he commented. "It would be like eating a lion or a hyena." "Some of the guards say that if you eat the heart of a lion, you'll gain his strength and bravery," Ammon responded. Balashi snorted. "If that was so, I warrant lions would be extinct, and the world would be full of heroes." "But if it were so, a wise man would capture a herd of lions and raise them to harvest their hearts, like a shepherd raising sheep for wool," Ammon countered. "A group of lions is called a pride, and any man proud enough to try to raise one would be sung up for 1,000 generations. They would call him Uruk, food of the mighty lion, and his symbol would be the skeleton picked clean," Balashi said. "The gods would make him into a constellation for his valor, and the picked skeletons would forever shine down on us from between the stars of Tiamat, the water dragon, and Shedu, the winged lion," Ammon replied, laughing. Just then, they rounded a bend in the road, and the gates of the city stood open before them. Great stoned winged lions stood to either side of the arched entrance in the wall, and on their backs stood a massive 8-pointed star, Inanna. "Hey," Ammon said. "There are the Shedu now. Where do you think the bones of Uruk lie? Buried beneath the roadbed, perhaps?" Ammon chuckled at his own joke, but Balashi said, "Hush. There is a time for levity, but it is folly to mock Ishtar at the entrance to her dwelling place." "I wasn't mocking Inanna," Ammon protested. "I was mocking a non-existent hero, Uruk. If Inanna is a decent sort, then I think she would laugh at him too." "Be still," Balashi insisted, with a squeeze of Ammon's forearm. The half-dozen guards to either side of the gate seemed bored. They were not paying particular attention to anyone, but as Ammon and Balashi drew near, one of the soldiers waded out into the mass of people passing through the gate. The soldier tapped an older man who was leading a donkey laden down with vegetables. He led him to the edge of the road and began inspecting his cargo. Ammon wondered what it was about that particular man that had caught the guard's attention. Then he noticed someone following along behind the man. It was a pretty girl, about his own age. The old man's daughter, perhaps? While the first guard kept the old man engaged as he inspected the produce, one of the other guards, a swarthy, hairy man with a huge, bushy black beard and jutting heavy eyebrows, approached the girl and made a suggestive sign with his hand. The girl slapped him, and the other guards laughed. The bushy-bearded guard, red-faced now, reached out to try a more physical approach. The girl's father noticed his daughter being manhandled and angrily said something. The other guards, content until now to just watch, took exception to the man's tone and started pulling some of his produce off the donkey and throwing it in the mud, making some comments about the quality of the food. The red-faced guard was holding the girl close and growling something aggressive. In an instant, the situation had gone from a funny, harmless way for the guards to pass the time to something ugly. Ammon took half a step in the direction of the guards, not sure what he intended to do, but feeling angry at the disrespect and aggression the guards were showing toward the farmer and his daughter. Balashi put his hand on Ammon's elbow and tried to steer him through the gate. "Let's go," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Someone should do something," Ammon hissed back. "Someone should," Balashi agreed. "But that someone is not me, and it is not you. Do nothing to draw attention to yourself, remember?" Ammon couldn't sit still and just let it pass, but he couldn't think of how he might resolve the problem himself. So he tried to think of a way to push Balashi into dealing with it. It took him a couple of seconds of thought, and then he had it. "The guards are defiling the city of Ishtar. Look at them assaulting that girl right below the 8-pointed star," he said indignantly. It was true. Bushybeard was standing almost directly beneath one of the rays of the star as he wrestled with the struggling girl. Even as he spoke, one of the other guards stepped up to give Bushybeard a hand. "Father once told me that the gods hold a man guilty for standing by and doing nothing when he might have stepped forward and changed things," Ammon said. Balashi stopped moving suddenly, and the crowd flowed around him like a river divided by a great boulder. Ammon had clearly hit a nerve. He didn't think that the gods would stand idly by and be mocked, and he reasoned that Inanna might bless his quest with success if he showed her that he respected both her and her city. His father had told him once that heroes were men the gods endowed with great power to right the wrongs of the world, whether great or small. Ammon hadn't encountered many wrongs in his life, at least not ones that he hadn't caused himself, but maybe this was his chance. He felt as if the very air crackled with the potential for portentous deeds. Balashi was pushing his way over to the guards. It was, now that his verbal pushing had been successful, that Ammon paused to consider the consequence of his actions. What was Balashi going to do? Whip out his knife and stab them? Challenge the bushy-bearded one to a duel? Suddenly, Ammon began to think that perhaps pushing Balashi into action wasn't such a great idea. Suddenly, a thought occurred to Ammon, with such clarity and conviction that he knew at once it had been sent to him by a god. Perhaps it was Inanna, inspiring him to end the trespass against her dignity here at the gates of her city. If Balashi, who was a barbarian Akkadian, reacted so strongly to a trespass against the dignity of Inanna, what would the people who were actually from the city of Uruk do if the question were put to them properly? "Hey!" Ammon said loudly, his voice pitched to carry above the sounds of the crowd. "Am I the only one who sees a guard mistreating a helpless woman beneath the star of Inanna?" A few of the passers-by stopped and paid attention. "What has that woman done to justify such treatment?" Ammon asked loudly. Several of the guards who were hassling the farmer stopped what they were doing and looked around, red-faced and ashamed. Bushybeard, however, was either too stupid or else too intent on what he was doing to stop. "Ishtar is the protector of women," Balashi's deep voice called out. "It's not right that a guard of her city should behave as this man is doing." "Let the girl go," someone in the crowd called out. "Stop acting like a bully," another person yelled. In a moment, there was a ring of irate people surrounding Bushybeard and his companion. Several women were telling him that he should be ashamed of himself, and one skinny old man was even shaking his fist at Bushybeard and threatening to box his ears for him. Bushybeard finally got the message once several members of the crowd began pelting him with small rocks and handfuls of mud, and at last he angrily pushed the girl away and fled the artificial hailstorm. The girl and her father crouched down to retrieve their abused produce, and then went quickly on their way. The soldiers did their best to act casual and go back to whatever it is they were supposed to be doing. The crowd began to disperse with muttered imprecations and angry discussions about the lack of respect these guards had for the people they were supposed to be protecting. Ammon and Balashi went through the gate with the rest of the crowd. Once they were well down the street, Balashi slapped Ammon surreptitiously on the back. "Well done, Uruk," he said. A small inner glow had loosened the tight knot of homesickness that had been almost choking him, and he was able to smile back and trade a few more jokes with Balashi. "The mistake those fools made was to awaken the wrath of the great hero, Uruk," Ammon boasted. "Anyone who challenges him will find himself fighting off an entire pride of dead, heartless lions," Balashi suggested. Ammon laughed, and they began casting about the market to see where they could get a decent meal for cheap. Before long, they had the thatched roof of a disreputable inn over their heads, and thick, brown gruel in their bellies. Then, at last, the great Uruk could relax on the disintegrating pallet of straw he would share with Balashi for the night and go to sleep.